Good evening. My name is Pat Young, the Planning and Development Director for the City of Raleigh. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It's a beautiful evening. You had a lot of other things you could do, but I really appreciate you being here to be part of our community conversations. This one is on neighborhood change and community growth, which is a very important topic, and it's a big piece of our Reflecting Raleigh, which is our next comprehensive plan that's intended to help provide policy guidance for our elected officials on how we grow through the year 2050. So your voice is important. This is part one of a two-part series for this topic. Next Tuesday or Wednesday, Bynum? On April 22nd at St. Matthew's Church, there'll be a State of the City presentation from our Assistant Director, Bynum Walter, and a series, most importantly, of tabletop conversations where we want to get your feedback. So this is a chance to get your voice heard. Tonight, if you have questions of our speaker, there are colored sticky notes and pens scattered around near where you're sitting. Please make sure to make any notes or questions that you have, comments or questions. Your question, we'll try to answer as many as we can tonight. And if we can't answer them tonight, we will publish a list of responses to all your questions. So tonight you'll hear a presentation from a nationally renowned expert and a great panel of regional practitioners that have worked deeply and closely in this topic of neighborhood and community change. So without further ado, I'm very, very proud and honored to introduce our speaker tonight, Alan Mallach. Alan is a city planner, a writer, and scholar, and those designations really undersell the incredible work he's done over his career, focusing on urban revitalization, neighborhood change, and affordable housing. He's widely known in the United States and abroad. He's a senior fellow with the Center for Community Progress in Washington, D.C. He's held positions in the public and private sector and has taught and lectured in universities in the United States, Europe, and Asia. His 2018 book, which I highly recommend, The Divided City, Poverty and Prosperity in Urban America, has been hailed as the best and most relevant book written on urban planning and policy in post-industrial cities in the 21st century, and I can certainly endorse that. So after Alan speaks, we'll turn it over to our panel to have a deeper conversation, but right now I'm going to turn it over to Alan Mallach. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and thank you all, Raleigh. I had a wonderful tour this afternoon, got a chance to see a lot of the city, and I got to admit, this is an awesome city, and I think you all should be proud of what you have here and what you've been doing in the last couple of decades in terms of building this city. I'm not saying there aren't problems and there aren't issues and challenges, but I'm just saying this is an awesome city, and I'm delighted to be here. And I'm going to talk about a couple of things. First, I'm going to talk sort of generally about some basic principles or maybe issues of neighborhood change. Then I'm going to sort of look at Raleigh and what's happened in the last, especially the last 10, 15 years. And then I'm going to talk specifically, as best I can, about neighborhood change in Raleigh. So, first, three basic principles. Neighborhoods matter. They're important. Number two, they change. They keep changing. I'll come back to that. And neighborhoods are markets. And I'm going to explain exactly what that means because that's perhaps the most important principle of all. Neighborhoods are driven by the market. What happens in neighborhoods is driven by the market. And there's only so much that community groups, local governments, philanthropies, and so forth can do to change that trajectory. So, first, neighborhoods change. Neighborhoods always change. There is no way, a lot of people want to see their neighborhood basically stay the way it is. It's not going to. The only neighborhoods, in my experience, that stay the way they are for long periods are either neighborhoods that are so rich and so gorgeous that they're always going to be in demand, or neighborhoods that are so devastated and disinvested that nobody really wants to be there. Everything in between constantly changes and cannot be frozen in one place for very long. Secondly, people move in and move out all the time. And when the people it's a very simple principle, when the people who move in are different from the people who move out, in any way, shape, or form, the neighborhood is going to change. And there are a lot of different ways in which people can be different. They can be younger, they can be older, they can be richer, they can be poorer, they can be of different ethnic or racial groups, they can speak different languages, but in all cases, the neighborhoods change. And this is something we all have to recognize. Nothing stays the same. So with that, and again, this comes back to a market. Basically, what a market is a relationship between supply and demand. You have a supply of something. In this case, in a neighborhood, it could be a supply of houses and lots. And you have people who either do or do not want to live in that neighborhood. And the balance and the relationship between those two factors is the most important single factor that determines the course of a neighborhood's future. And within each of those factors, there are a few key points. Okay, the first, what drives demand? Now, the first thing is in-migration. If you have a city, and this is Raleigh, where lots of people want to come and move to, that's going to push demand. Then there's internal demand from people who live in the city and who either want to move or have to move for some reason or another. Their family gets larger, their family gets smaller, they're making more money, they're making less money, they're evicted, etc. Then you have job and business growth. And again, Raleigh has had a lot of that in the last 10, 20 years. And then, of course, what else is available? So neighborhoods, this is kind of an odd concept, you might think of it, but neighborhoods are constantly competing with each other in the housing market. So when somebody moves to Raleigh, they probably don't have the idea, I want to live in such and such a neighborhood. I want to live in College Park. I want to live in Carolina Pines. They know they want to live in Raleigh. So they look around, and they're looking and seeing what different neighborhoods have to offer, and ultimately they make a choice. Now, on the other side of the coin, you have each neighborhood has a series of characteristics that determine kind of whether people are going to want to live there. First, the location. Some people want to live as close as they can to downtown. Some people want to live out in the middle of nowhere. What kind of housing is available, or what kind of lots are available, whether it's older housing, new housing. Do you want to buy a new house? Do you want to buy an old house, and so forth? What does the neighborhood offer in terms of amenities? Parks, schools, transit. You know, and again, what makes up a neighborhood amenity is different from each person. One person is going to look to the school, being near a school. Another person will want something completely different. But people look at amenities. And finally, stability. And what that means, and it's an important it doesn't mean that the neighborhood's going to stay the same. Again, I already said neighborhoods don't stay the same. What stability means in this context is people's sense of, is this a neighborhood where my investment, and when I say investment, I don't just mean money, but my personal investment is going to be safe? Is this a neighborhood that I can kind of count on not to collapse or crash or disintegrate for some reason? And so people want to have a gut sense of how stable the neighborhood is from the standpoint of their personal investment. Because when you buy a house, also when you rent to some extent, but especially when you buy a house, because that's such a huge investment, you're making an investment. You're saying, this is a neighborhood I want to live in. And the average home buyer stays in the same neighborhood for 13, 15, maybe 20 years, sometimes longer. I've lived in the same house for 41 years. And I like it, too. And you can't have it. But so these are all the factors that people look at when they decide whether to buy a house and where to buy it. And, okay, now let's switch gears for a second. I'm going to talk about Raleigh. Okay. Now, I like graphs. This shows who has moved into Raleigh between 2000 and 2010, 2010 and 2023, by their incomes. Now, it shows a very interesting thing. As you can see, on the left-hand side, you have lots of blue lines. On the right-hand side, more yellow, orange lines. And what this is making a point. Basically, Raleigh has seen a lot of in-migration since 2000 or probably earlier. But a big change happened somewheres along 10, 15 years ago. Up to that point, the people who were moving into Raleigh tended to be just about as rich or poor as the people who were here already. Then starting, as I say, 10, 15 years ago, that started to shift. And the people who were moving into Raleigh started to be people who had a lot more money than the people who were here already. And that is a huge change. Now, interestingly, it's not racially that different from the people who are here already. In other words, there are a lot of black people, as well as white people, and people of other ethnicities moving in. But the one thing they have in common is they have more money. And that's a critical thing that's changed the game completely. Second, there's another thing, you see this in the jobs as well. The blue lines, again, are the jobs that were added in Raleigh from 2002 to 2010. Now, during that period, the biggest growth in jobs by far in Raleigh was in healthcare. And then it switched. You see where the orange lines are. And again, 2010 is just a handy dividing point because that's where the data is. Somewheres, again, I say around 10 to 15 years ago, started to see a big growth in jobs in technology, in finance, in professional areas, and so forth. So again, you're creating jobs. This all relates to each other. You're creating jobs that are drawing people with more sophisticated skills, which are paying higher salaries, so you're getting more affluent people with moving in. So there was a real switch that happened. Now, so what we see, and again, to me, this is a really important point, that Raleigh hit an inflection point socially and economically and demographically, somewhere between 10 and 15 years ago. And so, for example, if you look, again, in this case it's the green, between 2000 and 2010, house values increased, but not by a whole lot. Between incomes, actually adjusted for inflation, actually went down a little bit. But again, when Raleigh hit the inflection point and you started to get this influx, basically an influx of money, of people with money, house prices started to take off, and household incomes also took off overall, but not as much as house prices. And so, as you can see, in 2000, the average house cost 3.25 times the average income. So that meant that pretty much there was a distribution of house prices that pretty much reflected the distribution of incomes in the city. People of most income ranges, obviously, if you are seriously poor or near poor, you're not going to be able to buy a house, no matter how cheap it is. But otherwise, most people were able to find a house they can afford. By 2010, it had gone up to 4 over 4. Then now it's around 5. So what's happening is that people are gradually being priced out of the market by the forces that are going on. Now, what's interesting about it is if you look at Raleigh, and this is something that's amazing. I mean, you've probably read the papers. For the last 5 years, if you follow housing news, the number one topic has been, we are not building enough housing in the United States. Well, and what that means is, generally speaking, we're building a lot less housing than we are creating jobs and households. And for the most part, that's true. But look at Raleigh. And this, I got to hand it to you guys. I don't know whether it's an accident or on purpose, but the number of building permits and the number of additional households and the number of jobs that have been added since 2010 are almost exactly in line with each other. And that is amazing. And now I compared Raleigh to a bunch of other cities. Now, in these other cities, I don't have the graph here, but it shows none of these other cities have come remotely close to creating one house for every job that's added. In San Francisco, it's like one house for every 3 jobs that are added. And what you have if you look at comparably fast-growing, strong economy, medium-sized cities in the United States, Raleigh has the healthiest ratio of housing costs to incomes of any of them. Now, does that mean it's great for everybody? No. Because, if you're priced out, it really doesn't matter if you're priced out by 50% or priced out by 300%. You're still priced out. But in relative terms, and again, we're talking about the force of the market. The fact that when you get people with much more money than the people who live here already moving in large numbers, that is going to push housing prices up. And there is nothing that the city can do about it directly. There are things that the city can do to help the people who are affected by being priced out, but there is nothing the city can do to change the real estate equation of money and house prices. And I know that may come as a very painful piece of information. I don't enjoy saying it, but it is something that we all have to understand. We are subject to the forces of the market, and the market is extraordinarily powerful. We can like it, we can not like it, but it is the reality. And the fact is, Raleigh has kept, proportionally speaking, more people still able to compete in the housing market in this city than any of the other cities that are going through similar economic growth dynamics in the United States today. And that's a good thing. Again, that doesn't mean everybody's fine. That's the tragedy of it, that it doesn't work. So let me shift, having said that, let me shift back to neighborhood change. So basically what happens, neighborhoods, as the regional market changes, and when we're talking about the people who are moving into Raleigh, we're talking about a regional market. Most of them Some of them move into the city, some of them move into the suburbs, and so forth. But that change, which is a combination of the job growth and the people moving in, and so forth, triggers neighborhood market change. Once the neighborhood's market starts to change, you start to see both the economic conditions, the prices, the demographic mix, everything else change in the neighborhood. And what those curvy arrows signify is that once the process of change starts, it's what we call an iterative process, because each change triggers other changes which create feedback between them. And so as people move in, they create change, more change happens, and it's a circular process. Now, if we look at what we all know, I think of as the G word, or gentrification. That's essentially, now one thing, gentrification is simply a form of neighborhood change. It's one of many forms of neighborhood change. It's not inevitable, speaking generally, but when you get the kind of income change and the kind of in-migration and job growth that Raleigh has, let's face it, it is inevitable, because you just have a changing demographic moving in. And what you're talking about, when you start getting more affluent households moving in, you start to see a bunch of changes. You see different people are in the market with more money, and they start competing for homes. And when I say homes, I'm talking about homes and lots. It amounts to the same thing. Sometimes that involves racial change, not always, but sometimes it does. But it definitely involves economic change and demographic change. And once more people with more money are starting to compete for the pool of homes in a neighborhood, prices of those homes are going to go up, because demand is changing. And once prices are going to go up, and this is another tough thing, is the character of the neighborhood will inevitably change. And it can change physically, and it is, I saw it this afternoon. There are physical changes that happen, and there are also social changes. And this is where I know one of the most difficult things to accept in many respects is that as the population of a neighborhood changes, the neighborhood changes in ways that can be profoundly uncomfortable for the people who've been living there for the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I remember I did some work some years ago in St. Louis. I talked to a lot of people, and I just remember one woman said, this was a neighborhood that had gone through a great deal of change, and there had been a lot of redevelopment, and she said, people don't, and she said, people don't want us to take our chairs out to the sidewalk anymore. And that was painful, because that was something that they'd done for a long time. There's a process of change that happens that goes beyond the mere fact that so-and-so lives in the house that Mrs. So-and-so used to live in, or that a house was torn down and a bigger house built. Stores change. The barber shop becomes a wine bistro or a bicycle repair shop. Another store goes out of business. People can't sit outside in front of their houses on lawn chairs. Or it's not that they can't, but they start to feel uncomfortable doing it. But the problem is, again, you can't stop the process. And it's a powerful process, and it keeps going, because what you're talking about in many cases is a complete rearrangement of the neighborhood, so you have, in some respects, it can be a generational change. There are a lot of neighborhoods where, and I can identify with this being one myself. The homeowners are, I was told that I shouldn't refer to them as elderly anymore. I mean, I shouldn't refer to us as elderly anymore. But you have a generation, there are a lot of neighborhoods where most of the homeowners are people in their 60s and 70s and 80s. And all of a sudden, and they're used to a certain thing, and then they start to get a lot of younger people and younger couples, and it's a change. And people have more income, people have more money, and it can be very disconcerting. And sometimes there's people have different lifestyles, different ways of being, different ways of acting and relating. You have a certain way you raised your kids, and then you watch this young couple next door, and you look at what they're letting their kids do, or the opposite, what you're not letting their kids do, more often than not, and you just want to go over them and slap them and say, hey. But so there, and of course, then you have educational differences, and we've got, in this country today, there's just such a cultural gap between people who are college graduates and people who are not, and all that. So the thing is, it's a very profound change, and it goes beyond just simply house prices. It goes a long way beyond house prices. But again, the problem is it keeps happening, and it's driven, again, not by things that the city or a nonprofit or a CDC can control. But this is the point. Let's talk about what the city and its nonprofit partners and others can do. They're not going to fix the basic situation. There's no magic wand. But they're saying, okay, so this is the thing. The city basically has only limited ability to change these basic trajectories. Now, one basic principle, and I'm going to talk more about this, is the more the city encourages development, more housing, both affordable housing and housing in general, the less pressure there is on existing houses. As a general principle, that doesn't mean that it's going to work on a particular block necessarily the same way it works in general. But the other thing, there are a lot of things that are not land use and planning things that can be done. So the first thing, basically when you think about land use regulation, it's kind of a continuum. You can try to regulate land use and development through your zoning and your site planning controls and everything else in ways that preserve the physical shape of the existing neighborhood as much as possible at one end, or you can try to maximize opportunity for development and redevelopment at the other end. And every land use regulation fits somewheres on that continuum. So, for example, if you want to preserve your neighborhood form, you maintain exclusive single-family zoning, and you create regulations to prevent, or to the extent possible, tear-downs. Now, suppose you regulate tear-downs. Suppose you say, we want to prevent people from coming in, buying small bungalows or shotguns, tearing them down and building bigger houses. It can be done. You can draft a set of land use regulations, and I can explain in detail exactly how, if anybody's really all that interested, that will essentially make it not worth anybody's while to tear down an existing house. But do you want to? And I'll tell you a story. There's a largish town not far from where I live called Princeton in New Jersey, which has gone through somewhat of a similar dynamic. Until about maybe 20 years ago, it was always a fairly affluent place. But until about 20 years ago, it was pretty much of a mix. And in fact, there was a whole section of the town right at the edge of downtown that had been, since the 19th century, a working-class black and Italian neighborhood. And there were a bunch of 60s subdivisions scattered around, just like there are in Raleigh. And people starting around the turn of this millennium, you started to see a lot of teardowns, because you had a lot of very affluent people coming in and buying up small houses. And so people were up in arms. And they complained to the town council, and the mayor and the council instructed the planning director to prepare an ordinance to prevent teardowns. Okay. Then, so the ordinance was drafted, and then as people started to realize, hey, wait a minute. If I can't sell my house to somebody who wants to tear it down, they're going to offer me a lot less money than if they can tear it down and build their dream house on that lot. And for a working class family, that house is my asset, period. And so I was saying, do I want to throw away $150,000, which I can either use for my kids' education or pass on to my grandkids or whatever, on behalf of some aesthetic principle? And and as people thought about it, they said, no. And the next thing you know, people were saying, maybe we don't want that ordinance after all. And in the end, the town council tabled it, just put it off, and said, never mind. So everything's got trade-offs. If you tear downs, there's no question. Neighborhood change is likely to go faster with tear downs. But on the other hand, for a homeowner for whom that is their asset, it maximizes their value and the amount of wealth that they're able to either benefit from or pass on to their children and grandchildren. And that's significant. The same thing is true of when we talk about creating development opportunities. So I expect many of you are familiar with what Raleigh has dubbed the missing middle program, and allowing small multifamily townhouses, small multifamily buildings and so forth in neighborhoods that have historically been single-family neighborhoods. Overall, if you look at Raleigh as a whole, though the ability to build that housing has a moderating effect on price increases in the housing market. That doesn't mean it's going to have a moderating effect on house prices in the next block to where it's been built. So it's uneven. But this is one thing, and this is why I guess you have a city council and a city manager and a planning director and so forth, is from the city's standpoint, they have to look at the big picture. And one of the things you learn, and I spent many years working for city government as a housing and economic development director, running a county development authority, doing a lot of stuff. And one thing I learned, there is no way on the face of the earth when you're a public official and you've got decisions you've got to make, that you can make the decisions so that everybody ends up happy. You are always going to make some people unhappy. But what you have to do is be motivated by a sense of what is the common good and what is the just way of making people happy or unhappy. If you run government to make rich people happy and poor people unhappy, that's not just. So you have to be motivated by a sense of social justice, but in the end, you cannot make everybody happy. So going on, so what should, other than maximizing development opportunities and creating more housing of all shapes, sizes, and maximizing affordable housing development. And I was told that in the last 7 years, Raleigh has built between 500 and 600 affordable housing units a year, each year. Now, that's not enough. But it's, again, in a world where the resources are incredibly limited and the market is working against you by pushing the cost up every day, it's pretty good. But they should still do more. So what? What more? Okay, the first thing is to really leverage whatever public resources and public powers, whether it's in terms of land use or tax or otherwise, to maximize affordable housing production or production of smaller, less expensive units that may not be technically affordable housing in the sense that they are publicly subsidized and you have to be of certain income levels to live there, but are still relatively affordable. One is, and I think there are a lot of creative ways to try to use the city's, whether it's taxing powers, whether it's financing powers and so forth, to try to incrementally increase the amount of affordable housing. I think the city made a significant commitment, I think it was 5 years ago, through a bond to support affordable housing. I think 5 years is a pretty good interval before it's time to start thinking very seriously about another one. So obviously, the city can never afford to spend the amount of money that would solve all of the affordable housing problems that the city has. But it should, and I think the city officials understand this, spend a certain amount of money within its means in that direction. Another thing is, so the city has adopted a very flexible ordinance to encourage people to build accessory dwelling units. I think the city there are a lot of things the city may want to think about doing to go beyond just simply the permission to particularly encourage lower income homeowners and help them create ADUs. So for example, one of the problems, I just recently finished a small study of the experience in the western states with ADUs in California, Oregon, and Washington. And one of the things that was noted was that the vast majority of homeowners who created them tended to be affluent homeowners because it was very hard to get affordable financing to do it. And most of the people who did it either used home equity loans or their own, or savings or things, rather than try to find financing. So maybe the city could look at working with some of the local banks to create a good, feasible, affordable loan product to allow people who do not have the ability to self-finance to create ADUs, as well as modest housing plans, pre-approved contractors, and so forth. Because the nice thing about ADUs is that they are mostly rented out to the public. The numbers that are used for somebody's grandmother or, as a home office or something are relatively small. And they tend to be rented out at lower levels than the market price for the same number of bedrooms, between 10 and 25% less. So it really helps people in the neighborhood and creates a source of rental housing, which is needed because, after all, while the homeowners will benefit from being able ultimately to sell their homes for a higher price, renters cannot. And then tiny homes, cottage courts, again, create as much housing that will be, by virtue of its small size, its character, and so forth, priced affordably or rented affordably, is a huge asset. But, and this is where I want to finish, is it's not just about land use. Land use is critically important. Land use strategies, what housing to encourage, what housing to not necessarily encourage, how to put together financing with land use and so forth. That's critically important. But there's a lot that goes way beyond that. And here are a few thoughts. The first one is a lot of the homes that are owned by low-income homeowners are in serious need of repair. And there rarely is enough money to go around to address those needs. That's a critical need. And I think there are ways that some of the money perhaps could be recouped over time, but having programs to enable older homeowners to stay in their homes, to have safe, healthy accommodations for as long as they want to live in that home, is a critically important part of the picture. Secondly, the same is true. Now, in my experience, in most cities, when you talk about older, struggling, lower-income homeowners, everybody nods. When you start talking about problem rental housing, and that it's also a responsibility of the city to try to figure out how to improve rental housing, or perhaps even help landlords improve their own housing, people start looking at you a little more skeptically. But I think it's just as important, because a lot of human beings live in that housing, and it's really important. Also, a lot of the older rental housing, the older garden apartment projects, the small single-family houses that are being used as rentals rather than owner-occupied and so forth, are still some of the most affordable rentals in the city. And helping to preserve that stock and make sure that it meets sound minimum standards of being healthy, safe housing is another critically important piece. Part of that is regulation, but part of that is also coming up with the financial tools and resources to either help willing landlords who may not have the means themselves to upgrade their properties, or, if necessary, helping nonprofit groups and so forth to acquire those properties and maintain them. Thirdly, and this is something I don't think people pay enough attention to, is when new people, by and large, the people who move into neighborhoods where most of the existing people who live there are not like them, they're not evil people. They may have more money, their skin color may be different, but they're not evil people, and they're not, by and large, people who want to do harm to their neighbors. They, in fact, as often as a general rule, want to be part of the neighborhood, want to make friends with their neighbors, and want to relate. And sometimes just the fact that people don't know each other and that people don't trust each other creates a dynamic in a neighborhood that can be incredibly destructive of neighborhood character and can accelerate the process of people feeling uncomfortable and alienated in the neighborhood that they called their own. So I think something like back, I don't know if it still exists, if it may not have existed for decades, because it's something I remember from my younger days. The U.S. Justice Department, back in the days of, I think, Johnson and Kennedy and so forth, had an arm called the Community Relations Service. And basically, these were people who, when there was a neighborhood that was going through conflict, and a lot of it was racial conflict over racial change or school busing or a lot of the controversies that were going on in the 60s and 70s, they had people who were trained community relations specialists, mediators, and so forth, who would go to a neighborhood and start sitting down with people and getting them to start talking to each other and start communicating. And something like that, it seems a little fuzzy and maybe woo-woo, but I'm serious. I think getting people to talk to each other. Life is too short to hate each other. Just getting people to talk to each other, to understand that they share the same basic desires for their neighborhood and their community, and that they can get along, is something that's extraordinarily important and very rarely taken seriously. And finally, I think, now, Raleigh has not done a bad job. If you look at how incomes have risen across different racial and ethnic groups, it's been pretty consistent across. In other words, the gaps have not, despite the influx, the gaps have not gotten wider. They haven't gotten much narrower, but that means they haven't gotten wider, which is important. But there's still a lot of room for improvement. The best way, in the long run, to address a lot of the issues that Raleigh is grappling with is to try to ensure that everybody, whatever race, ethnicity, age, background, and so forth, has the opportunity to benefit to the greatest degree from Raleigh's economic growth, from the jobs that are being created, from the business opportunities that are being created. And in the long run, that's perhaps the most important thing that the city can do to create healthy neighborhoods. Thank you.
Another round of applause for Alan. If anyone has questions, we have time for a few questions. If you have them already jotted down on those colored sticky notes, please hold them up, and a member of staff will come and grab it for you. It just helps us have a record of what gets asked. If we don't get to your question, we're going to type up all of the questions and we'll publish a report online so that everyone can see the responses afterward. Any questions? Yes, I will take them. So question number 1. In the description of this meeting on the web, it says we'll discuss solutions, opportunities, and challenges related to managing growth while honoring our roots. What does honoring our roots mean to you?
Honoring our roots, that's complicated. I think it first means, Raleigh is changing. Today's Raleigh is not the Raleigh of 10 years ago, which is not the Raleigh of 20 years ago. But this city came from someplace. This city has a tradition. This city has a culture. The people in the city have cultures. And that's as true, equally true, of the city's white people and the city's black people. Now, we know historically, for all kinds of reasons, that Raleigh was a profoundly unequal place. And I believe, some people I've talked to feel that things have improved, that to varying degrees. But I think we have to recognize, when I think of honoring our roots, we have to recognize that Raleigh comes from multiple cultural traditions, and all of those traditions are worthy of respect and have to be maintained and honored and given voice. And secondly, that Raleigh has to recognize that it comes from a tradition of profound inequality, and that rendering justice in light of that inequality needs to always be part of every public strategy or effort.
Well, another question for you. In your opinion, how much infill will the city need to be able to slow down the sprawl or more suburban pattern of development?
Well, a lot of the sprawl is happening outside the city limits. So the city, the one thing I thought was interesting, and a couple of people I spoke to mentioned, that actually that houses in some of suburban Raleigh, the outer line, are less expensive than housing inside the city, than comparable housing in the city. And I thought that was interesting, and in a way that's maybe an argument for sprawl, but I'm not sure. No, seriously, it's a complicated question. Raleigh cannot, I don't think you can influence even what happens outside the city limits. So to the extent that somebody wants to build subdivisions out in the middle of the countryside or fill in, but the key thing is that Raleigh should be trying to build as much infill as is needed to fully accommodate all of the demand for people who want to live in Raleigh, and hopefully enough so that when people move to the region and try to make a decision about where they're going to live, that they choose to live in Raleigh rather than in an outlying suburban community. Now, I can't put a number on that because we don't know how many people are going to be wanting to move in. But we do know over the last, going back to the numbers, that over the last, we've been 15 or so years, I'm going to double check here, that last 13 years, we've been seeing about 4,000, round numbers, 4,000 new households moving into Raleigh, into the city of Raleigh every year. So that assuming, the economy continues to grow, Raleigh continues to be a magnet for jobs and businesses and so forth, that's kind of a lower limit on the number to continue to produce plus or minus 4,000 new units. Now, when you say infill, obviously some of those units are going to be infill in the classic sense in terms of relatively small lots sandwiched within existing development. Others will be stuff like is happening in North Hills and other places where we're just talking about massive, large-scale development. Obviously, you need both. The sum total, though, should probably be no less than 4,000 units a year as a target, maybe more.
Thank you. Maybe one more question for you. And this question is, how does a city incentivize builders to build smaller, more affordable housing when the profit seems to be in size, fit, and finish?
With great difficulty. Basically, what you might, frankly, from a developer's standpoint, looking at it from the developer's perspective. See, one of the problems of the whole real estate industry, and every aspect of the real estate industry, it's all driven by percentage of the total. In other words, it's not driven by how much you make as a salary, or it's driven by percentages, whether you're a realtor, whether you're an appraiser, whether you're a developer, whether you're a contractor, and so forth. What really matters is you're going to get a percentage of the final result. And so you want the final result to be as big as it possibly can. That's why realtors love to get contracts for $1 million houses and hate to get contracts for $200,000 houses, because they're going to put it, if they have to put in the same amount of work and they get only 20% of the end result, it's not even worth it. So they don't put in the work. They take the listing, they don't put in the work, and, well, we know about that. But so it's going to be difficult to get the conventional developers to do it. You can think of a couple of possibilities. The first is to try to find nonprofit organizations with high development capacity who are willing to do such things. The second is to identify city parcels, city-owned parcels, which can mean either parcels the city currently owns or has obtained through various means, or even going out and acquiring parcels to offer at feasible prices to either nonprofits or developers specifically for the production of that type of housing.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to transition into the second half of our program now. I'd like to invite up our panelists to come to the stage. I'm Sarah Shaughnessy. I'm a principal planner in the Department of Planning and Development and the manager for the Reflecting Raleigh project. I'm going to moderate the panel, and as the panelists come up, I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. All right. So thank you all for being here and joining us for this neighborhood change community conversation. I'm going to start by introducing Dan Levine. Dan is the Director of Real Estate Development, or Real Estate at Self-Help Credit Union, a CDFI focused on creating and protecting ownership and economic opportunity for all, especially people of color, women, rural residents, and low-wealth families and communities. So welcome, Dan. Brandy Thompson, also with us, is a principal at Clearscapes, an architecture and design firm. Brandy's experience includes a range of public and private sector work, often requiring consensus building among complex stakeholder groups. Many of the projects Brandy has led are historic tax credit projects and contribute to the preservation and revitalization of historic districts and cultural heritage sites across the state. So welcome, Brandy. Tiffany Elder is a highly accomplished real estate professional investor based in the Triangle. Beyond her professional achievements, she actively contributes to community initiatives focused on affordable housing and equitable economic development, showcasing her leadership and advocacy in the Triangle area. Tiffany is also a faculty member with the Incremental Development Alliance. And then last but not least, Yvette Holmes is the CEO of Southeast Raleigh Promise, Wake County's first purpose-built communities model. Southeast Raleigh Promise works alongside residents, key partners, and funders to ensure that families and individuals living in and around the Rock Quarry Road corridor have access to equitable opportunities to grow, thrive, and prosper. So welcome, Yvette. Thank you all for being here. I'll start maybe with a question for all of you. I introduced you, but I wonder if you could say a little bit about what you do and how you think it relates to neighborhood change and the conversation tonight.
Sure. I have the mic, so I guess I'll start. Hello, everyone. I'm Tiffany Elder, born and raised south side of Chicago, but I've been here in North Carolina since 2001. I love it here. I'm not planning to go anywhere. I am a realtor and licensed general contractor, builder here in the Triangle, so I see both sides of the coin when it comes to neighborhood change and development and all the topics that we're speaking of here today. So yeah.
Again, I'm Dan Levine with Self-Help, and I've been at Self-Help for about 18 years and working on real estate development, really in partnership with a lot of community leaders, other nonprofits doing affordable housing, other community development projects. And so neighborhood change, I mean, you think about the last 18 years in whatever community you're from, whether it's here in Raleigh or somewhere else, and think about how much change there's been. It's pretty remarkable to see, and you know, a lot of positives of change too, and obviously some downsides.
All right, good evening. I'm Brandy Thompson. Again, I'm a principal at Clearscapes, and I think the thing that I'm most thankful for, maybe that's a way to introduce myself, is that Clearscapes has had the opportunity, and I personally have had the opportunity to work on many civic and community-based projects here in town. And so really getting to partner with communities to help understand what their stories are, what's important to them, and really try to find ways to tell those stories is kind of part of our heartbeat and the thing that keeps me going to work every day. So,
thank you. Yvette Holmes, the CEO of Southeast Raleigh Promise. And before maybe a point of personal privilege, this is my church home, Watts Chapel, so it's fun to be here. Part of the reason why I said yes to the invitation, and other members of Watts, our pastor, Pastor White in his absence. Just thank y'all for hosting and coming out to visit us here at Watts Chapel. So I am been a resident of Southeast Raleigh for over now, I could probably say close to 30 years, and I live along Rock Quarry Road. And for those who are familiar with the area, it's just outside. Southeast Raleigh is vast, so they're like 18 square miles, but the neighborhoods that we focus on at Southeast Raleigh Promise are mostly inside the Beltline along Rock Quarry Road. And so we're very privileged and fortunate to be able to have the opportunity to do that. But these neighborhoods are also, for the most part, predominantly African American. Our elders, another name or term that we use when we refer to our longtime residents, or legacy residents as we like to refer to them, are those individuals that we have constant contact with and conversations with, and look forward to sharing more about the work that we do in the community.
Thank you. Yvette, maybe I'll stay with you since you have the mic. In your view, what creates a healthy and vibrant neighborhood? What are the pieces that we need to put together?
Yeah, I think it was said already by the keynote, who did a wonderful job, and I look forward to connecting with you after this. But I think every neighborhood, like people and place matter, and every neighborhood should be a neighborhood where people can grow, thrive, and prosper. I mean, and that means economically, that means socially, that means from your health and well-being. It is about a sense of belonging and feeling a sense of belonging. And I think the rub, at least from my conversations that I have, both with my neighbors and people that I know, and my own children for that matter, we've raised 3 sons in Southeast Raleigh, is that the changes that are happening and that we all see, it's kind of like our faces are pressed against the glass and we're not a part of the change. And we don't have a say in the process and how our neighborhoods do change, understanding that there are market forces that we can't control. But sometimes the change is happening so quickly that we just feel left out. And so I think the more we can engage and make sure that the people who are most impacted by the change have a voice and a say in the matter, I think it makes for healthy neighborhoods and communities in my vantage point.
Do you want to answer that, Brandy? The pieces that make a good, healthy, vibrant neighborhood?
So I do think, and I agree, I think a place for people to be seen and known and to relate. And I think you also very gracefully spoke about that in your keynote presentation, that, you know, everybody wants to connect. And I think we need spaces that allow people that might look different than ourselves and might come from different economic means to gather together and to get to know each other. So community spaces that really foster exchange of ideas, exchange of culture, I think is really important.
Yeah, thank you. So next question, anyone who would like to take this one, how have you seen Raleigh or the region change in the time that you've lived here?
Pass it to the person who doesn't live in Raleigh for that one, figure.
The region, Durham.
The region. I think, kind of like Alan's keynote presentation, like population growth and job growth is probably the driving factor across the triangle. So many people moving here. I grew up in the area, but I meet so many people who ask me where I'm from, and when I actually say I'm from this area, they're like, look at me like, oh, wow, I haven't met one of you recently. And that's, you know, it's a good thing in a lot of ways to have like a diverse community that has all these new people moving in, and there's a lot of challenges when population growth outstrips housing supply in particular. And so I was gonna say, sorry to sort of be a politician to answer another question, but to build on what Yvette said, I think the concept of neighborhood vibrancy partly being, do the people who live in that neighborhood have some agency in the changes that are happening, or some influence at least, is key. And so if you think about things like ownership rates, we know there's big disparities across groups in who owns property, their own homes, other properties. And so as the communities change, like how do we make sure that people in whatever neighborhood we're in have opportunities to, like, quote unquote, control the dirt, control the properties that they have, so they can have some influence. The market's still very powerful. You're not gonna prevent change from happening, but how can you be part of it is sort of another way of what Yvette's saying.
Sure, and I guess to tack on to that, and to go back to the first question of vibrant communities, what I've seen change a lot over the last 20 years that I've worked in real estate here is pricing for one, population for two. And that's not just like the end pricing for people who are looking to buy and to rent. That's the input pricing, land and construction costs and all those things that go in on the front end too. It's amazing how much that's changed over time. Fortunately and unfortunately, I've seen our communities change as well. I believe that the best communities are those that are socioeconomically diverse. That's what I sought out when I moved here. That's where I wanted to live when I moved here. And it becomes harder as things change and as prices go up, and everyone can't, sort of latch on and hang on while those changes are happening. So I think communities that allow for people to remain and to thrive in the community through every phase of their life, to me, are the healthiest communities.
Thank you. Stay on you since you have the mic. What are some of the challenges to providing enough housing for residents and keeping that housing affordable as the city grows? I know Alan touched on that. I'm curious
Yes.
what your experience is as a real estate professional and a developer.
I will put both the realtor hat on this side and the builder hat on this side. Organizing my thoughts, I'll say three main things. First, our construction costs are way up. I built my first new construction in 2006. I built it for about $60 a square foot. To build the same level of quality now costs me about 2.5 times more, just construction costs. We're not talking about the land. That first lot that I bought to build that construction in 2006 cost $15,000. That same lot today would be close to $100,000. So it's the inputs, the construction costs and the land costs are way up from where they used to be, and it makes it really hard to provide housing, especially like me, if you want to provide housing for everyday people, to create these vibrant communities. The other thing that I think we touched on in the presentation, and thank you for this, the other thing that we really need to think about is housing needs are changing. And not only do we not have enough housing, we don't have the type of housing that we need for the changes that are happening. I will give an example. I'm going to use round numbers so my brain doesn't explode. Let's say we have a city of 100 people. 50 years ago, the average household size was 3.5 or so people per household. Now it's closer to 2 people per household. So if you have a 100-person population, and assuming the population didn't change at all, you go from needing 35 houses to house people back then to now needing 50 houses to house the same 100-person population, just because the housing size changed. You have 2 people per house now, so you need 50 of them. You had 3.5 per house, so you needed, a little north of 30. We need more housing even for the same population, and we're crashing up against the issue of our population's growing. So our population's growing, our house sizes are shrinking, but over the last 50 years, the average size of a newly built home in the US has blown up to about 2,400 square feet. So we're building for the big families of 50 years ago instead of building for the smaller households of today. And that's where the conversation about density and, creating an atmosphere where builders like myself who really want to build good things, for good people, giving us the latitude to be creative in a responsible way so that we can make sure that we're putting housing on the market that's meeting the needs of the market and that isn't meeting some archaic need that we're imagining from back in the day. That's some of them, but yeah.
Thank you. Dan, this question is for you. We often talk about the value of mixed use and walkable neighborhood retail as a component of vibrant neighborhoods. How can cities support small businesses and create opportunities for them to thrive as neighborhoods evolve? And I'm curious if you've worked on any projects as part of your role at Self-Help that you could speak to.
Sure, and one of those neighborhoods is right here in Raleigh, over off Rock Quarry, and so I'll let Yvette, who's one of the leaders of that, speak more to that. But yeah, I agree, mixed use areas are kind of in favor, and they're probably one of the reasons we talked about inside the Beltline housing cost more than out on the edge of town, because when you think about vibrant neighborhoods, ability to get to a doctor's appointment, to a park, to a playground, to retail shops, restaurants, all of those things that people value and that I think show up in the market pricing. So how do cities help? For one thing, I think zoning, we haven't talked a lot about it, but historically it's changing a bit, but still in a lot of cities, it's really hard to build mixed-use communities because they're zoned in a very, segregated by uses type of way. So how do we at minimum get rid of barriers that prevent us from building the neighborhoods that we actually love? There's a lot of communities in the Triangle that if you ask people their favorite neighborhoods and they take them around, they've got multifamily apartments for rent. They've got single-family houses. They have the bar on the corner and the barber shop. And if you literally aren't allowed to build that, that's not a great starting point. You know, there's still more to do, so how do you incentivize maybe small businesses? So could it be facade grants? Could it be loan programs that have public and philanthropic and private dollars aggregated to help encourage business growth and help people take those risks, and to help, frankly, builders like Tiffany who do really great smaller scale projects? I think you'd say it's harder in general to get financing for those projects than it is for a large tract home builder or a multifamily apartment builder. So how do we try to basically pick out like all of those components of like, what do we love in these mixed use, walkable, dense communities? And then what's stopping us financing, zoning, regulatory issues from actually achieving that? And I don't know, Yvette, if you want to talk about.
Thank you, Dan. So as Dan mentioned, Southeast Raleigh Promise is leading Raleigh-Wake County's first purpose-built community model. It's a national model. We're one of 25 plus nonprofit organizations across the country. It is a place-based initiative, and that is simply to say that we're hyper-focused on neighborhoods. We have a purpose-built community campus. It is the beacon site off of Rock Quarry Road, is where co-located on this 32-acre campus, what used to be the Watson Flea Market for those who are from Raleigh, is now a Southeast Raleigh YMCA, Southeast Raleigh Elementary School, 120 affordable rental apartment homes, and a 2-story commercial retail space, Beacon Point, that was developed by Self-Help. It was a multi-phase approach. The YMCA of the Triangle acquired the land. It's been 15 years in the making. It really started out with community conversations. It is such a long process. I probably would take 30 minutes to explain it all to you, but I do want to let you know it started with a conversation. And I think that was said earlier about how we just came to the table and said how we imagine and envision our community and what more and what services we wanted in our community. And it now has resulted in our having, again, adopted this national model. And we are the community quarterback. And so we created essentially a neighborhood within the Beltline. To the left of us is 40. We're minutes in walking distance from downtown Raleigh. We have small businesses. We have our first cafe in Southeast Raleigh along Rock Quarry Road that's going to open. It is a locally owned and operated business. Matter of fact, the owners live in my neighborhood in Farmington Woods. We have healthcare services on site. We have legal aid that's moving there. It's just a hub of resources. We have a self-help credit union branch. So like everything is right there, and it's open to everyone, quite frankly. I mean, you can go to that campus any day and it could be any number of people there, children playing and the like. And so I think that took a collaboration by, willing partners to make that happen. But it's also going to be the catalyst for more to come along Rock Quarry Road. So that's just one example. And in the city and the county, all the various funding partners made that possible. So,
Thank you. If you want to keep the mic, the next question is also for you. So we talk a lot about how growth can cause constraints or pain points for us. It can also bring opportunities. So how do we ensure as a city, as a community, that those opportunities are shared equitably?
I mean, I think that's the work we have to do, right? There are a lot of pressures that are creating tension right now in communities, and particularly in Southeast Raleigh. People, the thing about Southeast Raleigh, and I have to remember that when we talk about Southeast Raleigh, like I'm talking about my home, my community, and oftentimes Southeast Raleigh is described as being underserved, under-resourced, underutilized, all the things that are not positive. So I like to say Southeast Raleigh is a place of promise and opportunity. It's not the people, it's the place. Right, and so what we're in the business of doing is making sure that there's an environment in the community wherein people can grow, thrive, and prosper. I say those three things matter. Like I have to be able to see my kids who grew up there, their friends who who play basketball in our front yard. They have to know that they can stay in their community and still thrive. Right now, if you live in some parts of Southeast Raleigh, and if you don't have a car, if you don't have access to resources, you can't get to the better paying jobs. So it's really about the economic mobility function, and I think that's where the city can invest and make sure small micro businesses can grow and thrive, that jobs can be created in Southeast Raleigh so people don't always have to leave their neighborhood. I say that I spend a good portion of my money outside of my community, because we don't have all the resources that some places like a North Raleigh or other parts of the county and city have. So our job really is to make sure that we attract those opportunities, but more importantly, that people who call Southeast Raleigh home can grow their businesses and also create those opportunities.
Thank you.
And the city and the county is an important part of that, I like to say.
Yeah. Brandy, this question is for you. So comprehensive plans, the Reflecting Raleigh project that we're working on now, typically have a time horizon of 20 years, which means we're often thinking about future generations as the beneficiaries of the work that we're doing today. Are there particular projects you've worked on that illustrate creative and effective ways to retain existing community places while also allowing for the development of what we might call new historic assets, buildings, landmarks that are built today that might be sort of considered historic for our future generations?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And there are several projects that kind of bubble to mind. One of our most beloved projects was working on the John Chavis Memorial Park and the community building there, and just the way that we were able to meet with the community to listen, to really kind of mine the stories that mattered. The significance and the history of that place is just immense, right? And yet it suffered from just years and years, generations really, of disinvestment. And to then be able to come alongside the community and tell those stories in an exuberant and vibrant way, to bring new life to those spaces, to bring back elements that were fond memories of the neighborhood. And that's been one that has been, I think, especially special for us, and that we would hope would serve as a community anchor in a future historic place.
Yeah, thank you. Another question for you, but open to anyone to answer it. How do we create and retain a sense of place as neighborhoods grow and evolve? We heard from Alan that change is really inevitable. How do we retain what makes a neighborhood, and how do we decide what's worth retaining?
Yeah, I think the real key there is a willingness and an openness to really listen. So there's a vast history of any place or space that you come to. There are really important community places that, maybe are not in the greatest shape today, but have been like the heart or the touchstone for that community for years. So really doing some research and understanding almost at a academic level what has served as those historic places in the past, but then listening and saying, okay, community A, B, or C, like I may, even though I'm a Raleigh resident, I may not be party to the exact stories, and then just trying to find ways to implement those key elements to be saved.
Thank you. So this is another question for Yvette and Dan, whoever wants to take this first. How can the city, through partnerships with other entities, help residents stay in their neighborhoods if they want to stay? And are there specific projects that you've worked on that illustrate how this can be done well?
So I do want to add to the piece about preserving history and place and culture. And we don't want to be reduced to just, a plaque or a marker, right? Like you have to really be intentional about what it means for people to feel a sense of belonging. And you could do that in a number of ways: oral history stories, just making sure how we build and design in communities also, because we're going to look up 10 years from now and not recognize our neighborhoods. And I would hate for that to happen, but you do have to have great development partners or developer partners to do this work with us. So that's one thing. But I would say one project that we're working on that is in addition to the Beacon site is that Southeast Raleigh Promise is now a developer of affordable housing, rental housing, and that we got funding from the city of Raleigh to develop missing middle or small scale affordable housing on 9 city-owned parcels in Southeast Raleigh. We will be developing a mix of duplexes, a single family, and ADUs, and Alan talked about that earlier. And that is one way the city and the county invested in that project, and we look forward to prayerfully breaking ground on that this summer. But that is one way that we can ensure that there's it's rental, but there's opportunities for housing in all neighborhoods. We don't want people to feel like the pressures of being priced out And so these are neighborhoods that are in walking distance of downtown and walking distance of transportation and all the resources we talked about earlier. And then part two of that, we are working with our legacy resident ambassadors to connect them to the city programs that are available to do the home repairs. We have a lot of conversations about property tax relief programs and partnering with legal aid to do the will and estate planning so we can preserve generational wealth. So those are just some examples of what we're able to do as a community-based organization working at the neighborhood level with the residents and alongside the residents.
All right, Sarah, so I'm going to try to answer your question with an example. So there's a community that I've been lucky to have a small part in working with in Chapel Hill and Carborough. So sorry to be right down the road from NC State and talking about UNC. But a neighborhood called the North Side, and so historically African-American neighborhood that crosses, Carborough and Chapel Hill lines. To Brandy's point about listening, the work in the neighborhood really launched to the next phase by a kind of student and an academic project that was about oral history. They were really listening to longtime residents in this community, been there 50, 60, sometimes 80 plus years. And they were really just doing the recording, like learning about civil rights history, learning about neighborhood history, learning about individuals. And from that, they started kind of recognizing, all right, well, this is living history and this is something that should be sustained. This isn't the plaque or whatever, the report on the shelf. And so they really started hearing, all right, so what are the pieces of neighborhood change that are affecting this community negatively? What are the positives? And they really flipped, and by they, the lead is a group called the Marion Cheek Jackson Center, which I encourage you to Google, the Jackson Center in Chapel Hill. And they really started working with local governments, working with community residents, working with philanthropy, reached out to self-help and to other nonprofit housing developers, and started saying, how do we actually take some control over the property in our neighborhood? So it's everything from literally a land bank that acquires properties so that there's an alternative for longtime residents who are moving out of the community that they can sell to a community-minded group rather than to a rental investor from out of town. They do wills clinics, they do property tax relief programs, they do a heck of a lot of community organizing. There are social events, cultural events, things that aren't narrowly about preserving or managing change, but really help tie the neighborhood together. There's home repair work. There's just this kind of comprehensive range of things, and it's been sustained. Self-help's been in partnership there for 10 plus years. The work definitely predated us by generations. But there's a lot of focus, a lot of collaboration on this, and it's not about keeping this neighborhood kind of in amber and not changing. Like the community leaders are really like, we welcome students. It's exciting to have new faces in the neighborhood. It's exciting to have these students volunteering at our elementary school. So it's kind of like, how do you embrace the changes? How do you meet the new neighbors? But how do you also recognize, I think, the community roots piece that we were talking about earlier? How do you build on that legacy?
Thank you. Is there anything else any of you would like to share before we open it up to questions from the audience?
First, thank you, everyone, for being here. And it sort of leads into the thought I was pulling together, which is like everyone that's sitting in this room here can play a role in making our communities better, making space in our communities, creating that vibrancy that we're speaking of, whether you are swinging a hammer or helping with financing or lending ideas or. There are so many parts to the development process that everyone can play a role. I know a lot of people, when they hear the word development, they think, slick, shiny suit person over here are the only people who can participate, and that's just not true. So if it's something that's in your heart, just seek out someone to have that conversation about where your skills might fit, because it really takes a community to make a community.
And I'd say show up in support of things too. We all know, I'm guilty of this too. It's very easy to go to a city council meeting or something and oppose projects. That those people are going to show up, but are there things you can get behind? Even things that are change and that might stretch your comfort zone a little bit. I think we need more of those faces in the room that say, hey, this isn't perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. And so say that to challenge myself too, is like, where can we actually get behind something and push for it and not just throw throw tomatoes when we don't like something.
And I want to add to that, oftentimes when you hear opposition to affordable housing, just the title itself can, conjure up thoughts about who lives in affordable housing, and typically that is what the opposition is the people, the person, or individuals who you might think occupy. But I would say everybody, if you just think about it, everyone wants housing that they can afford. It doesn't really matter what income bracket you might be in. It's just that people who have more modest means have fewer choices. And oftentimes when you hear opposition from people, the people who are opposing it oftentimes are doing it from the comfort of their own homes. And at the end of the day, people need places to live. And if we care about our neighbors, and yeah, it's never a perfect solution. My neighborhood is changing. I live in Farmington Woods, like I said, and I could see the change. But I also welcome it. And I think, as everyone has said here, is that how do we embrace it, but how do we do it that we're inclusive of all voices and positions, thoughts, and opinions. And so, which is why we're here, and you all are here tonight as well.
Thank you all so much. We'll do, a round of applause for our panelists. If you have questions for any of our panelists, if you could, same way, please write them down on sticky notes and hold them up. A staff member will collect them and bring them over to me. Yeah, of course, that works. All right. All right, so question number one, how have recent changes in DEI made it harder to ensure fair and equitable growth? And I think the question is sort of about federal level policy changes.
Well, that's a big question too. And I think it's unfortunate that we're in a time where we can't even talk about equity or even say the word or anything remotely close to DEI. And I think as it relates to neighborhoods, and it was said earlier, just something as simple as if we think, smaller scale ADU type style housing is the way to go, you have people in communities who just don't have the financial resources to even develop for a whole host of reasons. Historically, being locked out of the lending market and not being able to get loans and the like, or if you're 60 plus years old, the thought of pulling equity out of your home to build something and going into more debt. So sometimes it is an equity issue, right? Sometimes it's the lack of knowledge and understanding of how those things work. And so I feel like at the federal level, there are unique challenges and a lot to unpack in this one setting, but I do think locally we have to be sensitive that not all things are equal. And equal is not really what we're thriving for, right? We're really looking for how do we help meet people where they are, and it's more of a conversation around fairness and equity. And so, and justice, yes.
You went right to it. Absolutely. I know just from conversations about projects and financing and things of that sort, there were funding sources that were earmarked to create opportunities, and some may say to right the wrongs of the past, some may say to create opportunities for the future. However you want to frame it, some of those sources may no longer be available moving forward, so we're going to have to get even more creative and try to figure out how to work around that and how to create more opportunities down the line. That's the GC side of me. The realtor side of me, I've noticed a push in the realtor community for understanding fair housing. There's even a new fair housing requirement for realtors now that wasn't in place before, so everyone has to be well versed on it to make sure that they're treating folks fairly. So I was pleased to see that push in the community of folks who are creating housing opportunities, and given that a lot of property managers are licensed realtors, rental opportunities as well, because fair housing extends to homeownership and to rental. So that's one plus side once everyone gets on board and gets their CE requirements done in fair housing and gets all their trainings done. But yeah, we're gonna feel it, but you can view it as a curse or a challenge. I view it as a challenge and a way to figure out how to be more creative and still make things happen, because that's what we do.
And I'll add, I mean, let's double down on the fact-based things that we can do. So like, for instance, since we're talking about neighborhoods, homeownership is disproportionate. There's a big disparity between, for example, black families and homeownership rates and white. That's truthful. Maybe that's controversial to some people, but it's a fact. Homeownership is still the biggest source of intergenerational wealth. That's a fact. Most people would agree, whatever part of the political spectrum they're in, that giving people opportunities to earn the right to have a mortgage, to pay that mortgage, to buy their home is a positive for communities. So how do we do those things that are like aligned, or whatever your position is on DEI, or you name your issue, where do we have common ground where it's like, well, that's good for society, and so let's do the things that create opportunities for all people to become homeowners, business owners, first-generation college students, whatever it may be. And so I'm not diminishing, I hear you on the question, but it kind of echoing what my panelists are saying. What can we do that's totally legal, totally consensus type of ideas, and really make sure we do that well, always, no matter who's in power?
So what are your thoughts? Alan talked about preserving sort of below market rate housing, what we sometimes refer to as naturally occurring affordable housing. What are your thoughts on how we can do that effectively? Anyone?
And I do want to add one quick thing too. When we talk about minority participation and all the development, we are in a wealthy region, and there are billions of dollars in real estate transactions. And I think if we just are committed to doing the right thing and making sure that subcontractors and small minority-owned businesses have a way, and you create a level of a scope wherein they can bid on those opportunities so that they too can build wealth, is also another way that we can. And I tell people, I don't care what you call it. Like, you just need to be committed to doing the work. If you don't want to call it DEI, don't call it DEI, but be committed to doing the work. But in terms of the NOAA, or the naturally occurring affordable housing, which are older units that don't have subsidy tied to them, but they have naturally low rents or below market rents, I do think it matters who owns it. I think it's all about the real estate at the end of the day, and the city and the county can continue to build up those acquisition funds wherein they can go in and acquire those properties. And then you partner with a mission-based organization, be it market or a nonprofit, and then you work to preserve those units. And we have seen over the last 15 years, units being acquired by a profit-motivated developer, and then those people end up getting displaced. They come in, they make a few improvements, upgrade the cabinets, put in new flooring, and the rent goes from what was affordable at one time, and now it's out of reach. And those individuals, unfortunately, get displaced. So I think we have to have an aggressive acquisition strategy to make sure that we're preserving those units.
In addition to acquisition, I think we need to encourage and not penalize those owners of naturally occurring affordable housing so that they maintain the properties and they aren't incentivized to sell to the highest bidder. I'm aware of multiple, but I'm thinking of one very large family-owned NOAA rental property owner here in the Triangle, and they, because of how many properties they had and the costs now of updating properties, they were slowly going through their inventory, fixing them up, but not fast enough. And so they were penalized by violations, et cetera, because of neighbors complaining, as opposed to neighbors maybe trying to get in touch with the owner and find out what was going on, and find out that they actually were working through their inventory, but everything can't happen overnight. And that led to them selling off a package of about 30 properties in the middle of, it was East Durham, old East Durham then, selling off a large package of properties that they otherwise would have kept and tried to work through and fix up. Now, that one, we got lucky. We were able to find a buyer to buy them who also had not a profit motive, but a true housing motive in that community. But two of the other bidders for that package were pure profit motive bidders. So we were able to sort of preserve that portfolio and get it to the right buyer in that case, but that's not always the case. So maybe, pull some of the layers back on the onion if something stinks and try to figure out why things are going that way, as opposed to sort of going after penalizing that owner without having an understanding and creating a situation where they just don't want to be bothered anymore and they sell to the highest bidder.
And maybe to build on that, this might be counterintuitive, but I think to really allow building to happen, to make it easier to build in the long run, and this gets to Alan's talk too, it doesn't mean every single block and every single neighborhood's going to benefit from that, but if it's actually possible to build multifamily housing and other housing throughout the community, I think it is easier to make sure that that's not all channeled to tearing down naturally occurring affordable housing where it's allowed to do that. So, great example in a community nearby that I'll call Scrapple Thrill. Recently they've changed, but for quite a few years, it was very hard to do multifamily apartments except in particular places. Those places mostly had older multifamily apartments. What do you think happened? Well, developers came in, recognized they could build luxury apartments and make a lot of money, but the only place they could do that was allowed was in these older neighborhoods that were zoned that way. So what do? Bottom up, pushed people out, knocked the houses down. If it had been possible to build multifamily housing one lot over where it was woods or lighter density, perhaps it wouldn't have solved the issue entirely, but it could have helped take the pressure off of just knocking down the existing naturally occurring housing.
Thank you. So we know that neighborhoods aren't just homes and sometimes businesses. They're also the roads, the street lights, the water infrastructure. This question is, how can infrastructure keep pace or keep up with changing neighborhoods? I don't know if any of you have any insight into that question.
Oh my gosh. All right, well, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that, in talking about developing higher density, larger scale developments, the infrastructure often doesn't, it can't keep up with that demand that's placed on it. And I do think the city often, and I think this is something we can do as a place, and I think the city of Raleigh does this strategically, but to identify areas where, we really want the density along bus routes, along, places that are connected and would allow for a variety of housing types, but to invest the infrastructure improvements in those areas and then allow the development and the housing to follow. So basically the development follows the city investment. So that's something that I think has proven to work many, many times in the past and is a really strong way that the city can lead where the focus of that development occurs.
Yvette, this is specifically a question for you. Somebody wanting to know how they can learn more about Southeast Raleigh Promise and ways that they can get involved.
We can talk after. We can go out for a cup of coffee or tea. But certainly you can reach out to me. I have my contact information. But our website address is serpromise.org. And Miss Brenda, who I don't want to overlook, who's here today. Raise your hand, Miss Brenda. She's on our team. She's a resident of Southeast Raleigh and has been for many years. But you can reach out to her too, and we can get connected. Love to have you over and give you a tour of our campus and tell you more about the work that we're doing.
Great. So this question is about form-based zoning, which we do not have as part of our code in Raleigh. We have an urban form map, which dictates a lot of urban form. If we wish to preserve the community's sense of place, this question is, shouldn't that be a tool in the toolbox? And I wonder if any of you have sort of experience using that tool, working in communities where a form-based code is part of their land use or development ordinance, and how that can be used effectively to preserve resources and create a sense of place.
I was going to say, I wish I had experience with that.
We'll move on. All right. This may be our last question for the evening, and we'll compile all of these and publish a report so everyone can see the questions that were asked. But But this question is, how can we bring important conversations like this into neighborhoods most affected so that residents have a real say in the decisions that get made? I think a lot of times the city expects residents to come to them. We can try to host events in communities. We're not always effective at bringing everyone to the table. So do you have any strategies for how residents can really lead the conversations?
So, for any other builders and developers in the room, this might be make you a little squeamish, but I do feel like that communities and the developers who are working in those communities should be in conversation. Who initiates that conversation? Y'all can decide. I know a recent neighborhood that I was looking at, I pulled together a charrette just with neighbors and said, hey, this is what I'm thinking of doing, but I really want to understand, what does this community need? And they were able to give me the insight of, everyone who lives here loves this community. We don't have housing where, hey, if someone moves in and has children, there's move-up housing available. We don't want the big mansions here, but we want something that's sort of the in-between, so that people don't have to leave the neighborhood just because they have a growing family or they're moving their parents in or something like that. So can you include part of that in the inventory that you're planning to build? That's something that I wouldn't have been aware of. I would have just looked at what was in the community and seen what would have worked in the numbers and gone with that. So I think conversation can be mutually beneficial. Why I started off by saying it might make the builders and developers squeamish is because sometimes when you invite a lot of voices to the table and let people in on what you're doing, you get so much pushback that it slows effort. And in development, days equal dollars. And every day that something's pushed back is part of the reason why some of the projects become more expensive. The longer you have to spend going through getting special, special allotments for your land, getting special approvals to do certain things. Every day that passes, you're racking up a bill for it, and that has to be built into the price of what you sell on the end, because you are a business and you have to sustain to the next day. So keeping in mind that it's a two-way street. I do know a lot of developers who want to have a lot of voices at the table, but it's a two-way street in order to sort of come and neither the builder nor the community have a chip on their shoulder so that true understanding can be found and so that concerns can be shared in a way that's productive and isn't just trying to halt progress, which again pushes those dollar costs up.
Of course.
And to piggyback on that, going back to what can we support? Like, what do we actually want to see happen in our communities? And I think, at least on the margins, builders might be pretty excited to, put in a few affordable units or make sure their front porches that match the community aesthetic, things like that. If they know somebody's going to show up to the council meeting and say, hey, this isn't perfect, but we're pretty excited about having this. I know I'm oversimplifying, but things like that is like, where can we look for common ground on these ideas?
And I will also say that from the developer side of it, what we have to be sure to do, and sometimes private developers or developers period do this, is that it just becomes a checkbox, right? So you don't allow yourself enough time to go out and meet and greet and get to know and build the trust and relationships with the community. And it's an afterthought. And so what I would encourage the developers to do is to have conversations with community on the front end from the time that you're talking about concept and design. And yeah, you might hear some things you don't want to hear. It might add cost, but you just be upfront and transparent. Like, I would love to put a pool here, but I can't. I would love to do this, but we can't. Or we can do this. This is a great idea. We hadn't thought about this. And so in another forum, and I'm looking at Dr. Lane, he runs the Southeast CAC, which the city of Raleigh has kind of reconstituted those opportunities for neighborhoods to come together to learn about development projects and things. It's kind of reimagined from what we might remember from the CACs of old. But, he faithfully holds these meetings. I don't know, is it every other month? Dr. Lane. And a lot of this is on their own resources. And so I think when these meetings are held, the community should show up, because it's a great way to learn about what resources are happening. And then the organic work that we do, I go back to the promise, just meeting with legacy residents who take their time during the day to come out and meet. So a lot of this is you can host it, but if people, like y'all came here tonight, but if people don't show up, you know, like you're being here tonight is really what it's going to take to stay connected and involved.
Since we took 4 swings and missed on the form-based code, I'm recognizing Sarah, Bynum, others who actually do this for a living. Is there anything you wanted to say about that? My understanding, I mean, form-based code partly means just getting away from segregating uses, kind of classic zoning. And I think there's a lot of restrictions on actually design standards in terms of what cities can regulate, but I didn't know if you all wanted to answer that question since we did not.
My understanding is that it regulates form or sort of facade or what the building looks like, material-wise, more than it does use. And so the restrictions and the standards are based more on what it looks like rather than what is in the building. But Bynum can chime in.
I don't want to get my mic too close to Sarah. Good evening. Thanks for being here. My name is Bynum Walter. I'm an assistant director in the Raleigh Planning Department. Raleigh has a modified form-based code. It's not purely form-based, but it is largely form-based. For example, we regulate density by building height, number of stories, and number of feet versus density, number of units on a particular site. So a lot of communities regulate density by something that is called floor area ratio, which basically is saying like how much floor area do you have in relationship to land area, right? In Raleigh, because we regulate by number of stories and the number of feet in the stories, you can basically, the density is really set by what you can accommodate in the form, not by a particular ratio. And because we don't have parking minimums in Raleigh, basically it's what you think will fit and will sell, right? And so the market is has a lot of room to adjust what it builds based on how much parking it thinks it needs. So downtown, where there's great transit and there are lots of shared parking resources, maybe you build fewer parking spaces in relationship to the square foot, usable, active square footage that you build, versus somewhere more suburban that you know everybody is going to drive there. For example, maybe Crabtree Valley Mall, right? Really high parking ratio in relationship to the retail space that's there.
You got that?
Talk to Bynum afterward if you need. We will be available, at least staff will be available for a little bit longer. We're at 8 o'clock, and so I want to wrap us up first by thanking our panelists again for giving us their time this evening. We really appreciate your expertise. To our keynote speaker, Alan Mallach, thank you so much for flying down and joining us. Thanks to all of you for giving up your evening to come and talk to us about what we think is a really important issue. Obviously, you're here and you think about it as an important issue too. Again, all of this content, the questions you ask, the following community conversation on neighborhood change, where you get to engage in dialogue with your neighbors and with staff, will inform the vision and goals and policies in Raleigh's next comprehensive plan. So please come back next Tuesday. We'll be at St. Matthew's Church. We'll have a presentation from Bynum and then a series of tabletop conversations following that. And finally, thank you so much to Watts Chapel for hosting us. We really appreciate the lovely venue and letting us have a meeting here. So thanks, everyone.